Good evening. Does everybody have a handout? Anyone missing a handout? Okay. Okay, thank you. The title of the message tonight is, You Are a Significant Person to God and to others as well. If you'll turn with me to Romans chapter 12, verse 3, we'll be looking at, starting with verse 3 and then looking down through probably verse 8 or 9. It's interesting, Paul talks in Romans chapter 12 about, he talks about, first of all, in verse 2, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good, perfect, acceptable will of God. And then he goes in, he begins to talk to the church at Rome about basically the persons, about people, about the significance of people. There's a danger, he talks about it in verse 3, that kind of pulls two different directions. One is toward the belief of being, the danger of being superior, and the other end of the spectrum is basically moving toward feeling inferior, less than acceptable. So he focuses on both of those, and he makes it clear that neither one of those positions is accurate in terms of God, as far as God is concerned, because every individual is of value and has worth. And he explains that a little bit as we get into verses 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So God has a place for every individual, every born-again believer. God has a place, and every believer is significant. I put this quote I came across a number of years ago up here on the board. I am me. I will always be a second best somebody else. And what Paul's saying in verse 3, he's saying, don't try to be somebody else. Be yourself, but be balanced. Maintain a sense of balance as a believer. Let's look, first of all, he talks about the personal worth. Let's look at these verses. Verse 3, he says, For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, notice what he says, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Interesting, as he talks about this concept of personal worth here, he says that every every believer has value. There's a relationship, and this is a rough design here, so you have to use your imagination, okay? This is the local church here. It's a small church, just a few people, okay? But what I tried to draw here was the fact that as we look here, you see different expressions, all right? And basically, the local assembly is made up of individual personalities, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Each person is unique in design. Each person is unique in design. We're unique in a couple of different ways. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 6, Paul talks about that, how unique we really are. He says, first of all, think about this. And I mentioned this, I think, a couple of messages ago. We're unique in terms of our fingerprints. We're unique in terms of our voice prints. We're unique in terms of our DNA. We're unique in terms of our eyes, even how it's structured. When there's an illness, you can take a high-powered camera, doctors can, and look at that, look at the construction of the eye, and there are colors that change in the eye when there are problems in certain parts of the body. Fantastic. God has designed us as unique individuals. Our design is unique. Now, as we look over here, the concept of uniqueness is a great concept, isn't it? That's a great concept. We're all unique. Now, think about that. what happens is when we bring all these unique Christians together, we have interesting designs. There are effects. Because as you look, I tried to give a range of, and I left this one blank because I couldn't figure any more ways to kind of reflect that. Huh? Well, I'm not going there. We'll leave that alone. One of the there's a psychologist on the West Coast that basically has studied personalities and faces and everything else. His name is Ekman, and he has documented the fact that there are 10,000 expressions possible in the human face. Now, when you hear that initially, you think, what? You got to be kidding. But what he does is basically he's taken the forehead, then he takes the eyes, then he takes the nose, then he takes the mouth, then he takes the chin. And he's literally documented there are 10,000 expressions that are possible on the human face. Now you think that God's not a fantastic designer? He takes these faces that are all unique, and we're able to express emotions and feelings and everything else 10,000 different ways. 10,000 ways. So what a creator we have. But when you bring these people together in a congregation, then we have different perspectives. We look at things differently. We're all part of the same family by virtue of our faith in Jesus Christ. Okay, no one person is more important than anybody else. But we also have our own personalities. There's a thing called, one writer has said this, he said, there's no such thing as an immaculate perception, got the wrong word. That's how I remember, immaculate perception. And the perception is how we look at things and how we see people, how we interpret things. So we have all these people together, and they see the same thing, but they don't see the same thing. They see things based upon their own mindset, the experiences they've had, their past experiences, their expectations, their beliefs. So we have all these people together here, and these the uniquenesses are unique, but sometimes we look at things through different glasses, through different mindsets, and sometimes that creates a little bit of a struggle, and Paul's aware of that. We're also unduplicated in personality, and we've kind of gotten into that. We all have a body, we have a mind, we have a brain, that sort of thing. We have all the same parts. But as we look, we're different. We're the same, but we're different. And we're different because of our personalities, because of past experiences and everything else, because of our expectations. Now, those things can change. We can change our expectations. We can change how we look at things. We can change beliefs. But the reality is that 95 to 98% of the time we don't, because we like that comfort zone. We don't like change. I think I mentioned that before. I love it when you change, most of the time, okay? But I don't like to change. And when change occurs, but the interesting thing is that as we change, the way we impact other people is we change our behavior. But we often expect other people to change their behavior. So this person looks at this person and says, if you would change your behavior, everything would be okay. If you would change your belief, the position you're taking, that everything would be fine. And that person looks back and says, well, you're the person that's the problem because you won't change your opinion. And so back and forth we go. So the differences here, the uniquenesses are positive. God designed them, but they're also problematic, Paul says. Okay. Unduplicated personalities. You think about that. How in the world, all the people in the world are different in terms of their personalities. To me, that's mind-boggling. We can have the same, well from your own experience in a family, if you have several children, something can happen, and if you have two children, one will see it one way, one will see it the other. Their expectations are different. One is easy to get along with, the other's kind of difficult at times. One challenges you, the other just whatever you say is fine. And sometimes it's a little frustrating. Say, God, what have you done to me? But that's kind of the reality. You think about it, nanotechnology. They're discovering in the field of technology that things are changing so fast, but they keep breaking things down, and they discover they can go into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And they're astounded at the fact that they're just discovering these things, in spite of the fact that science has been around a long time. They're discovering that some of them are discovering there is a creator, there is a God, there is somebody who created this whole system and created us as individuals, and he's tremendously creative. We can look into a telescope. We can see a long distance. In fact, you can see the moon, but you don't need a telescope last night to see the moon. It's obvious. Beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. God designed that thing. Not only the moon, but the sun, the stars, the universe, the creation we live in. We can see world beyond worlds through a telescope. Now, if we take a microscope, we can get down to the smallest atom, proton. And God says, well, I've rolled all this into all these personalities here, these differences that we have. There's another thing called mirror neurons, and I may have mentioned this to you before. They've also discovered just recently that basically when you're talking to a person, sometimes you get a sense that that person, as you're sharing a concern or a problem, you get a sense that they understand what you're talking about. And you may not know them very well, but somehow you sense that they understand what you're talking about. They've had a similar experience, even though they don't tell you anything about it. You ever had that experience? And you walk away and you say, listen to the words, I felt really comfortable with that person. I felt like they really cared about what was happening and what I was sharing with them. It's basically a concept, it's micro, I forgot it now already. Mirror, thank you. It's my support system. Mirror neurons. And little kids, that's the same thing. They've never had courses in psychology. When you're working with little children, your kids, you notice when you talk to them most of the time, I'm not going to get down because it's hard to get back up now. But they're way down here, and to look at your face, they have to put their head back like this. If you do that for a couple minutes right now, you'll feel some pain. It's a stress, okay? But they know if they look at your face, they can read the emotions, and they know how to respond. And they'll change sometimes their comments to change, and they'll watch and see what happens. Pretty sharp. So God has taken a few inches of face, 10,000 expressions. Everyone is an original design. There are no copies. You say, well, twins are pretty close, but there's always a little bit of difference there. It just takes a little while to figure out what those differences are. He's created a unique people. Personalities, different qualities, characteristics, emotional basis. God's crowning creation was man. In spite of the sin even, God values man. Each person is unique. Every person has value. Sometimes it does become a problem, even in Christian circles, because we have expectations and we look at things differently. And sometimes when our emotions go up, whoop, There's a, show you a little diagram here quickly. This is kind of level balance. When our emotions go up, guess what goes down? Our ability to think. Our thinking goes down. When our emotions go up, our thinking goes down. There's a point at which our emotions go high. Here we can hear and we can listen. But when our emotions get so high, we can only hear, we can't listen. And listening is a psychological, it's the ability to process information coming in and to use that information then to change how we're looking at things or how we see things. So when our emotions get so high to a certain level, then we only hear and we can't listen. The only thing we listen to is something that, if the person agrees with what we're saying, we can hear that, but we can't hear anything else. As individuals listen to each other, if I'm the person that basically you're upset at, and I listen to you and really focus on what you're saying, and I reflect it back, you're upset because of such and such. Well, what will happen is that the emotions start coming down. As the emotions come down, the thinking process goes back up. Then I can not only hear, but I can listen as well. That's why Proverbs says, don't try to reason with an angry man. Because when the anger is up here, they cannot listen to what you're saying. They hear it. It's a physiological process, but they cannot understand. Any data you give is totally wasted. And that's why sometimes we'll say to a person, if they're upset and we're trying to help them by giving them advice and asking questions, and we'll say, didn't you hear me? Didn't you hear what I said? We say that sometimes to kids, right? Supposed to take out the garbage, and they don't take out the garbage, so it sits there for half a day. Did you hear me ask you to take out the garbage this morning? Yes, but I forgot. It wasn't included in the process here. They heard, didn't listen. Does that make sense? We come back down here. That's why the Bible also talks about be quick in James. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. If we're quick to listen, slow to speak, then most of the time the anger doesn't come because we're able to understand what's going on and how this person looks at things differently than we do. God says, I want you to be unified. Now, that doesn't mean everybody thinks alike. If God wanted all of us to think alike, guess what? We'd all think alike. We wouldn't have unique personalities. We wouldn't look at things differently. But God wants to take the individuals here, and he wants to use their uniquenesses and the way they look at things differently in order to help them grow, in order to help us grow, in order to help expand our understanding of each other. He uses it so that he wants us to be able to help each other, to encourage each other, to understand each other. And the only way I can understand Jeff is if I listen to Jeff and I begin to try to understand how he looks at things and how he's thinking. That means I have to step out of my mindset for a little bit, okay? Instead of saying, Jeff, this is what you ought to think. I don't understand why you don't understand me. I don't understand you. So then, could you put your hands up for just a minute? So guess what? If I push on Jeff, what's he going to do? He push back. Even a pacifist will push back. There's a point at which they'll push back. They'll push back. But if I do that, you see, and that happens to us as Christians sometimes, doesn't it? We push on other people. Interesting thing, if I do this, if I take the pressure off and I go like this, that ends it to some extent. That stops, you see, the dynamics are changed. And that's what Paul's trying to communicate here. Let's go back to that verse again for just a minute. He says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. He's saying there are some problems. There are two problems here with us as individuals. Two kind of extremes. One is that to think more highly of ourselves than we ought. And this, again, use your imagination here, okay? So here I am. See, I'm above other people, okay? Two pitfalls. Let not any man think more highly of himself than he ought to think. There's a danger of losing our balance when sometimes we think that we have immaculate perception. When we think we have immaculate perception, it's difficult for us to take in any information and to process things. So he's saying, don't put yourself up here. See, we're not talking about disagreements and looking at things differently. We're saying, Paul's saying, listen to each other. Listen to each other as you exchange. In the process, what can happen here is that you gain more information and knowledge, and you grow as a result of sharing. Paul says, the way he says this is interesting. I guess I've said that 4 times now, right? Paul says, have a sane estimate. A sane estimate of your abilities and capabilities. A sane estimate. What's he saying then? If you don't have a sane estimate, then it must be a what? An insane one. Not quite that bad. But he's saying you're up here. You're looking at things from the wrong angle. This is a caution against pride, against thinking that it's possible to capture all the information you need and to know everything you need to know. But that's part of the sanctification process, isn't it? God teaching us and bringing us along. But he uses the people here, he uses fellow believers to teach us things, to help us understand things sometimes that we don't quite understand ourselves. And he uses us to help them as well. There's an exchange process that occurs. We are not to judge ourselves by our talents, our wealth, our position, but by our Christian character. We call it what? The fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit. Humility, love, and concern for our fellow believers. Romans 12:16. Do think soberly. That's his goal. The word soberly means modestly, humbly, remembering that talents, wealth, and abilities have come from who? Come from God. But we're not finished yet. That sanctification process, well, take this off here. The sanctification process, we come to know Christ, we're justified. The sanctification process begins here. The sanctification process is what? Becoming more like Christ. He wants to change the way we look at things, the way we think. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, how you think. That's why in Philippians chapter 4, he identifies all these positive things, and he says what? Think on these things. There's all kind of evidence, research, and so forth that says basically if you focus on positive things, that's not to say we don't deal with problems. But he says if you focus on positive things, it increases the length of your life. It increases the quality of your life. But if you focus on negative things, it actually can poison your system. It can physically poison your body. So, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't express our appreciation to others. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't disagree with others, because that's that process of exchange here. The second pitfall he talks about is inferior, the person who begins to assess themselves as inferior. And I just erased that off there. Put them back. Superior,